Hello, everybody, again for another Saturday edition of Behavioural Science Club. You are all very welcome from wherever you are joining us. If you are new to us today, I'm Louise. My co-host is Prakash. We're very pleased to see you here today. And today we have the honour of having Guru Madhavan join us. Guru is an author, senior scholar, and director of programs at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine. He was a speaker at Nudgestock and gave a super talk at Nudgestock. Go on to YouTube and find the 2021 recording of Nudgestock. He came out with how you could pack so much into the time. Guru is absolutely a mystery to me. I just re-listened to it before we joined. He spoke so widely, calamities in the name of efficiencies. The trending on Twitter was, we all know the difference between medicine and poison is just the dose. The same thing with efficiency. More is not always better. Now, I'm not going to go over that whole talk, but as Guru told us, all engineers know you cannot optimize a system by optimizing its parts separately. It was just a superb talk, Guru. So let me ask you to unmute yourself, and maybe we'll just open by, for those of our members joining us today who don't know you, how do you describe yourself, Guru?
I used to be a freshwater engineer who happened to just migrate into the salt waters. My rudimentary training in engineering, so I'm a systems engineer by background with a biomedical flavor. So trained in the basics of systems, and everything can be commanded and controlled to your will and whim, as most engineers like to think about it. And I was born in India, brought up there in an Orthodox Brahmin family in a village. I used to be my grandfather's assistant priest in our village temple. But I've been in the US for the past 20 years. I came here for graduate studies. And that marked the transition from classic control systems to complex systems, which invariably and requisitely so involves human behavior and evolutionary perspectives to conduct better engineering design and responsibly manage the outcomes that come out of those designs. So that's how I started, and that's where I am right now.
And I love that straight away you touched on the human aspect of your interest, Guru. And again, I'm going to read a line from your talk, which was, you said, measures and metrics divorced from human behavior can backfire. So you're very much interested in the human aspect of possibly a subject that people think of as being possibly divorced from humans. So how is that, Guru?
So, as is the case with many engineers, they won't admit this publicly, but this is one of those kind of happy hour conversations. Many of my friends, including myself at one point in time, went into engineering to avoid working with humans. As you know, life teaches you different perspectives, and you get a broader kind of the consciousness around the outcomes of the work that we do. I like to think about this in terms of what Richard Bach, the famous novelist, once said. It's like there's no disaster that can become a blessing. And I happen to think the opposite way too. There are many blessings that have become disasters, and you pointed out the efficiency concept that we talked about. And thanks for recognizing my challenge, me needing to pack so many materials compactly within like 13 or 15 minutes, whatever. So that was a challenge. That was a kind of an efficiency at play to talk about meaningful inefficiencies. But I think responsible engineers really operate between the bounds, or perhaps they are comfortable with the porousness between disasters and blessings. How do you consciously convert a disaster into a blessing and not allow the blessings to turn into disasters? And that's the kind of cycle engineers fall into. And it's a kind of a consistent, daily, diligent practice, oftentimes unrecognized, usually invisible, that keeps the world running so that we can all connect and have a conversation on a Saturday morning or evening at our convenience to think about big concepts. So that's how I think about systems at large. There are disastrous systems and there are blessed systems. So that's the boundary.
And in your talk, you told several rather excellent stories that illustrated each of the different sort of varieties of either quite tragic efforts at being efficient and other ways in which maybe two projects had come together to create something. But today you want to particularly talk about highly effective system thinking. And maybe for us, just to, before we even launch into that, you'll tell us how you would explain the term system thinkers.
Yeah, I did kind of the initial probing of that in my Applied Minds, How Engineers Think, and that was a kind of a systems engineering filter to really appreciate the world. There are three common elements that you look at any serious form of engineering design, you can really spot. And the first one is the ability to bring structure where there's none. And I like to, this was a vivid lesson that I learned early on in my engineering education. Used to have a fabulous civil engineering professor who would ask us to build structures, buildings and bridges in our minds. And with no paper, no pencil, and they would all come eventually. But the challenge was to feel the forces and the stresses and the strains in your mind and then bring it to the paper. And so that was the starting point, kind of the initial stages of structuring. And engineers need structure to proceed. And of course, as we'll get into some of our conversations today, hopefully, complexity defies structure. So what the hell are we supposed to do when there's no, the system is just antithetical to the concept of structure? That's a challenge we all need to work through. The second element is invariably engineers work under constraints. There's hardly any form of engineering that doesn't happen kind of without the bounds of the scenario. There's usually something, whether it's a customer, a client, market requirements, sheer physical laws, biological aspects. So that's something you're always confronted with, which deeply ties into the third element, which is the ability to make judicious trade-offs. Engineering is inherently a sacrificial design profession. You cannot achieve everything in life. So how do you maximize the most out of the scenario while being responsible for the outcomes is the thing. So accountability is also kind of the connecting theme between the structure. You don't want to envision a structure that is infeasible or irresponsible for a particular scenario. And then ability to constraints, they're often dictated upon you. You don't have the luxury to select those constraints. And the third one is to relentlessly make the trade-off so that the sacrifices that happen in the design don't get translated into real world sacrifices, which is Mother Nature is just unforgiving when it comes to engineering design systems. Structure constraint trade-off is the way I kind of began to articulate the kind of the initial structure or a more minimum viable structure for systems thinking.
And in your nudge talk, and I think this ties in quite nicely here now, you told the story from your Applied Minds, How Engineers Think. You told the story of Alexander Fleming and the discovery of penicillin. But then you very adroitly segued in to tell us the second part of the story, which isn't so well known, about Margaret Hutchinson. So maybe would you mind just sharing the second part of the story, Guru?
Yes, absolutely. And that is something we're living through right now during the COVID crisis. The word engineering doesn't even get mentioned, whether it's convenience or neglect or just ignorance, because there's no way theoretically or practically, you can convert a lab notebook formula into a vaccine that's delivered on people's arms within 3 months. And that is the kind of the concept, and this is happens all the time, but how engineers are kind of the invisible bridges across every aspect we think about, and or think about the bandwidth that has enabled our connectivity during this, or the entire concept of telework that would be impossible. So it is not just merely producing a safeguarded process with effectiveness, cost, and lives at stake. But the idea is how we need to get good at recognizing these unsaid stories that we just conveniently set aside because that's just engineering. But without engineering, nothing would happen. So the thing with Margaret Hutchinson was when I first encountered the story, I was deeply affected by it. It was the more I thought about it, in the name of producing penicillin, how we have chosen to assign fame to certain individuals and not others. And the interesting part of Hutchinson is she was a traditional chemical engineer, and she was, I think, the first chemical engineer to graduate from MIT back then in the 1930s. And then she went into the industrial sector, and she had a variety of experiences. And this is key. Most practicing engineers do make that a default. The default is the diversity. And then from those experiences comes the mixing and matching of concepts. And in this case, deeply constrained, heavily structured, intense trade-offs with lives at stake. And with the deep time pressure to produce not 1, not 10, but 600 billion penicillin doses within a year or 2 or 3, while the war was happening, World War II, of course. So how do you achieve that is what really captured my attention, and I wanted to celebrate that. And there are many, many, many invisible figures in the world of engineering that enable science. And one needs to be conscious of the fact that it is not always science that leads to engineering. Engineering has been a mother of many different forms of scientific inquiries. In fact, engineering is much older than science. The word scientist didn't even emerge in our vocabulary till 1840s. So whereas the word engineer, as we have come to use it, is from the late 11th century. We were all engineers at one point in time. Perhaps the starting point of our civilization was engineering rather than discovery, inquiry, and search for truth.
That's fantastic, Guru. And as you say, the second part of the penicillin story is one that I would imagine, I mean, I've not heard it, it's something you discovered as well, so I'd say it's not widely known. The other thing that really struck me during your talk, Guru, was that you asked all of us to imagine if COVID had come in the 1990s, and the health and economic consequences, as you said, would have been worse. But then the list that you railed off of what we would not have had really, I think, even though all of us realized how simple it was in a way to walk from our offices, pop our desk, a laptop on our desk at home and continue in this way, it really sort of drove home an idea to me. I don't know if you can remember the full list of the items that you said, Guru. Maybe I'll challenge you there. I mean, there were about 8 or 9 things you particularly emphasized that obviously have made such an amazing difference in the way that we've managed COVID.
Yeah, we have an enlightened group here, so I think they can easily pick up like 5 or 6 intuitively here. But of course, the most obvious ones we talked about, the immunization and the internet connectivity, but also, of course, the often unrecognized part of the supply systems. Make sure that the avocados and potatoes and bananas arrived on time to our local supermarket, and they were available exactly where I needed, when I needed them. So that was still an amazing accomplishment given the grand disruption that we faced. But let me take a small detour about this. I mean, sure, we are faced with a novel coronavirus. We are adapting to its pattern. Viruses being one of the most prolific inventors our planet has ever seen. Yet we seem somehow completely comfortable. We give ourselves awards in the name of the patents we produce, the papers we produce. The viruses don't care for any recognition. They keep on inventing and going. So there's much to be learned from the virology there. And I think that's one of the persisting challenges. But going back to 1990, setting aside the novel coronavirus for a second, the CDC here in the United States had a similar issue. I think it was 1993 when they had a novel manifestation of hantavirus. And that was occurred in the US Southwest, specifically the Four Corners, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico. And it was an unusual spot for that outbreak. And the virus, based on previous experiences, didn't really emerge until that point in a landlocked region. Plus, this virus was doing something strange. It was affecting the lungs rather than the kidneys, the way our understanding had provided. So it seemed to defy all the conventional explanations that epidemiologists have thought of for it. And again, this is a very localized outbreak, unlike the global scenario that we are living through. But just to give you an example, how a small episode in the kind of the annals of public health can still remind us about explanation defying circumstances. And this is what the Carl Weick, the famous psychologist who I greatly admire, he studied organizations, anywhere from jazz bands to aircraft carriers, and he did some pioneering work in high reliability systems. How do systems work time and again, almost intuitively? And Carl Weick studied this phenomena of the hantavirus outbreak and came up with something called how this episode basically immediately diminished our knowledge, confidence. In fact, it boosted simultaneously the massive amounts of uncertainty, what he calls a cosmological attack, or the cosmology episode, where you have an abrupt vanishing of all the meaning and the senses, and you don't clearly understand what's going on around you. Now, COVID has, of course, tested us in the grand scale, global scale of the cosmological episode. So you're in a constant state of anxiety of what's going to happen. What is the emergent phenomena going forward? So this is where you can see, right, from an engineering design perspective, the psychological influences that we're talking about are just so key here. But in the case of hantavirus, the puzzle was eventually resolved. And it turned out that was the kind of the earlier part of our understanding that the climate change dynamics led to increases in rodent population in that area, and that carried the virus, and therefore the behavior was differently manifested. And eventually we got to it. And we're still figuring this out with the coronavirus. And I think the challenge now is the trustability of information, which adds kind of greater intensity and challenges to the cosmological experience that we are going through, because we still cannot agree on how the viruses. Of course, we have a strong scientific understanding of it, but the public acceptability of it is a big question. Where it originated, and at one point, wearing a mask was a political statement here in the U.S. at least. So I think. What COVID has taught us, and even if we were to imagine COVID occurring in 1990s, or even take other forms of outbreaks in the 1990s in a localized circumstance, we can learn a lot through these cosmological attacks that Carl Weick pointed out through his studies.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I've written that down, the cosmological episode. It wasn't a phrase I'd come across myself, so thank you very much, and really enjoyed talking to you. You have a super way of being able to explain complex things by using stories. So thank you very much, Guru, certainly for somebody who wouldn't have a great understanding of engineering. So I'm going to hand over now to Prakash, my co-host, who'll be putting a couple of questions to you. And then after that, we'll be opening up the questions for the members. So if you want to start putting your questions over in the chat box. Thanks very much, Guru.
Thank you so much, Louise. And for the people who have joined us for the very first time, this is a very informal club. There's no ceremony out here. It's pretty much chill. At some point of time, in the next couple of minutes, we're going to open up the session for Q&As to everyone out here. For people who know, you know how to do it. For people who are new, you're going to use the chat box, put in your question. Louise is going to be kind enough to moderate the session for us, and she'll invite us to unmute ourselves and ask the questions directly to Guru, right? And feel free to go down as deep, as wide as you want with your questions. And now there's something very special about today, guys. For people who are from India, Nepal, you know, today is Guru Purnima. And Guru in India, right? It means an enlightened person, a knowledgeable person who goes around spreading wisdom to those who seek it without necessarily seeking monetary benefits. That's a Guru. And Guru Purnima is a day where you celebrate the Gurus and say thank you, because you are the ones who enlighten us and make us better people. It's a lovely coincidence that we are here listening to Guru Mahadevan on Guru Purnima. Guru, thank you so much for joining us. Very glad that you could give us your time. And we are listening to you talk about engineers and constraints as one of the parameters within which they need to operate, which in turn spurs creativity. And that is something that engineers have in common with the other creative folks who are your, artists and writers and painters and creators in general. Engineers are also a creative breed. And then you have a book called How Engineers Think, right? And if you look at corporate departments, you have an engineering department, you have an HR department, you have a consumer research department. And if you look at the typical understanding in pop culture, the stereotype is, yes, they are very creative, they're amazing, but they don't understand human beings. That seems to be also be a stereotype at the same time. And you have a book out there, How Engineers Think. So I think the one question that you want to start with, Guru, is how exactly do engineers think, number one? And number two, is the stereotype wrong, or is there some sort of truth to this fact that engineers work better with system, and the same mind which is so creative is maybe able to map yet unable to map human? What exactly is happening? I'm not even able to frame the question properly, but then you are Guru, and I'm sure you'll find the right way to help us understand this.
Well, thank you for setting up this date and the introduction here. And no, it's a special day, of course. Purnima means it's a full moon day, and it's a vital day to celebrate the gurus. And as someone pointed out in the chat, so the Sanskrit meaning of my name, Gu, means darkness. Ru means the remover of, the dispeller of darkness. And my PhD advisor fondly called me a light bulb, and who's an electrical engineer, of course. So there you go. And with all the moon and the electricity you're talking about here, I think we can work something out for your question here, Prakash. You're absolutely right, in the sense that even though the book was subtitled How Engineers Think, there was a hidden parenthetical invisible word there. It should basically be how engineers should think. And I think that's where I basically ended the book, about how this collaborative engineering is by expectation, by history, a team process. This is not similar to the kind of the celebrity model that the one occasionally sees in other forms of intellectual practices, a lone investigator going after some understanding and comes in, whereas engineering is pretty much entirely different. Since we're talking about moon, the most famous example of systems engineering, the Apollo mission was entirely an exercise in coordination, so that fragmentation could be mitigated. And the goal was to transport um, a hardware with living beings in it to a completely foreign environment. And that basically required a deep amount of synthesis, both from the physical understanding of the land you're reaching, plus of course all the making sure the requirements and the specifications down right to the process engineering needed to be left. So even though the human factors are inherent in engineering approaches, how do we get even more sensitive and intuitive to some of the needs rather than the requirements? And I think sometimes we miss out on the higher level question, which is the needs, and get straight to the specifications. Yeah, this is a client wants this prototype of 4 or 5 different things, and then try to do what's possible. You asked kind of the essence of systems engineering, and I had a version of answer to Louise earlier. But one such approach that engineers routinely practice is the idea of modular systems thinking, first to gain an understanding. So engineers are extremely good at separating a system into its components and understanding their behavior, how they work together on their own, and put them back together, see how they work together in unison. And I think this part of this kind of the iterative approximation of the reality. I mean, that doesn't mean you fully understand the reality. You basically fully understand the assumptions you make about the reality. And I think that's the whole idea behind model-based engineering, which is quite different than taking the evidence-based approach, which is needed because evidence invariably involves looking at the past, looking at the historical patterns, how certain systems have worked in certain conditions. Whereas to go proactively into some of the frontiers we are talking about, you invariably have to rely on models. And that model requires a kind of a systemic understanding of the circumstances you find yourself in. So the repeated reconstruction, deconstruction of a system and iterating them across contexts is something Mother Nature does too on a day-to-day basis. And that's the whole idea behind natural selection. But with engineering, you often are goal-oriented. In very few circumstances, you have the opportunity to do open-ended or blind engineering where you don't know what the product outcome is going to be. And what the application space is going to be and what the consequences are going to be. So that's the biggest difference between natural selection and engineering selection.
Wow, thanks so much, Guru. I want to quickly jump in on the same thing again. And I remember something from Jack Dorsey, the CEO, founder CEO of Twitter. And there was a statement that I remember from, I think, a couple of years back, maybe 2-3 years. He said something to the effect of, a mistake which he made when he put down Twitter in the early days. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing it, he said, I think we didn't get game theorists on board. So they got the engineering mind, they got the really good coders on mind to create that scalable, powerful system. And they knew how to make it work. But what they didn't, looking back, they probably should have gotten a game theorist on board. Maybe a and I'm paraphrasing again, right? Maybe a psychologist or a human behavior expert on board. And had they done that, maybe the direction Twitter would have taken would have been slightly different. And we know today that Twitter tries different kind of experiments when it's trying to cut down disinformation. Is there a change engineers need to do in the way they think?
Yeah, absolutely. And no, the question that you asked is a fairly perennial one, at least for the past 60, 70 years, especially when we got into new markets and the technology development had gotten rapid, that was enabled by many different forces in society. A famous example is from Xerox, when they were trying to manufacture photocopiers and how best to design them. And they had anthropologists on staff to really look at. They brought in some highly accomplished individuals, including Nobel laureates, and how long it would take someone to make a double-sided photocopy using that big gargantuan setup that was the original prototype. And they would take several minutes to even figure out how to insert the paper kind of thing. And it finally took an anthropologist who was just walking around, looking at how engineers were thinking about this, just looking at the odd, awkward behavior that one encounters on production lines or the design labs and whatnot. And then decided all engineers needed to do was put a big green circular button that one presses, and then the photocopy is made. That was a direct contribution of anthropologists in the system rather than engineers who are just trying to over-optimize certain functions and completely forgetting about the friendliness of the system to the user. Now, to build on your point here, I mean, we are living, again, it's a kind of an equivalent cosmological episode that we're having, where what do you do with too much information? Because the original version of the cosmological episode that Carl Weick was talking about was you didn't really fully understand the system, and there was basically a paucity of information. You don't, and your confidence is diminishing, and it seemed like it's an anxiety generator. Now you have too much information, now doing the exact same thing. Now, from an engineering perspective, can you, with the changes in the code, probably a few little changes in the code, disable the use of like, dislike, or retweet and share functions in Twitter? One can do that, but what are the consequences of it? Now, even though it is a technical decision, one cannot freely do that because that entirely changes the platform's offering, the way we engage in things. So I think even though we have some direct, simple engineering options available to us, the public constraint is you're not able to do that. So you're right. I think could Twitter, I mean, I'm a user of Twitter. I know much thought has gone into, much investments have gone into the design of this. Could anything be done better? Of course, yes. But I think how do you start with that more comprehensive perspective from the get-go is the opportunity we need to be honing in going forward. And that's where the behavioral insights and the evolutionary insights and the marketing insights need to be integrated more deeply into the practice of engineering.
So, let me again go a little further with the same question, Guru, right? And then we'll take up the Q&A. You made fantastic observational points. And one last question. Guys, promise, then we can start the Q&As, right? Guru, is all yours. The question is it possible that when a Jack Doss is looking back and he's saying, these are the mistakes I made, or when we sit down and we are looking at, you have a second book which came out 2 months back, I think, Making Better Choices, Designs, Decisions, and Democracy, which is about the art of how we collectively make decisions. And we always seem to be finding flaws. But if you just go up one level, is it possible that the world that we all are living in, the Twitter that Jack Dorsey made, this actually is the best possible version of the world that we could live in? Because all our insights, all our observations are nothing but hindsight bias. And if you look at it from that point of view, can you argue and say the world is just fine, this is the best we could actually be? Or is the argument, no, the world actually could have been, there could be a better version of a Twitter right now in a parallel world. There could be a better version of even Zoom. People say Zoom sucks. Many of us, there is Zoom fatigue, right? Which side is the truth leaning more, Guru?
Oh, that's a fantastic thing. And I know you have been thinking about this question for several weeks now, and here I am expected to answer this one. But anyways, I think no, you're raising a profound issue here. And that is the challenge that we have. How do you go about getting better at systems thinking? Let me answer your question, but not directly answering your question. Take a more oblique approach kind of thing. So one of the things I wrote about, I also edited an issue of essays back in December. Happy to send a link. Really looking at concept of unifiability in complex systems. From a physics perspective, the design of Twitter or any other application that we are fond of using might make eminent sense. But from an ecological sense, ecological perspective, they probably won't make that much sense. How do you simultaneously shift those perspectives, or at least use the kind of the filtering technique to really see whether you have a good enough design or so forth? But I think any application, just like Twitter, evolves under different constraints that are set by shareholders or regulators, however. But in this case, the social media company, again, the question about the regulation on social media is an active topic here in the United States. And I don't really have a crystal clear answer for that, because that's what going to involve a more nuanced form of complex systems thinking. So in that collection of essays, I wrote with my co-editors kind of a vision, maybe even an initial architecture, what I call the 7 habits of highly effective systems thinkers. And I'm just going to go briefly over that. And that might indirectly provide some perspectives, but not necessarily an answer to the question that you're raising, Prakash. But of course, we'll lean on the crowd intelligence here as well. The first one is specialize less, systematize more. That's the first habit. And you can see there are probably versions of the answer to your questions in some of these things. I mean, how by taking a more narrower approach, you might come up with the technology that does very well in certain uses, but not so much in other, or the inability to look at the potential consequences, first, second, third layer even. That's going to require quite a bit of reflection. So first is specialize less, systematize more. Now, this might sound like a completely unnatural act, because now we're all expected to hyper specialize and be good at 1 or 2 things. So how do you go about working across divisions and really, I mean, capitalizing on the power of abstractions to further your design and imagining your design in many different forms and formats and outputs, some of them undesirable. So that requires, in fact, there are practices within engineering where you do this kind of deliberate destructive testing. You break the damn thing and imagine the worst possible scenario, and then you go from there. So that's something. So the bigger point there is we need to examine closely the true value of the different specialization we have chosen to get into. The second one is get over physics envy, try ecology envy. And this basically says that we need less Newton and more Darwin. Engineering has had too much Newton and it'll continue to be that way, but very little Darwin. And I think we need to create pills that basically Darwinize the design process going forward. And I think that explains quite a bit about our hyper-reliance on reductionism. And in it might be an answer for your question, Prakash. The third one is evolve logic and psychologic. I know our good friend Rory Sutherland has talked quite a bit about this one. And but one of the things that engineers I think are depending on how broadly you're focusing on in terms of your reaching your design to the multitudes, we are encouraged to think about, and this applies even to algorithms, by the way, we are encouraged to think in terms of context blindness, platform agnosticism, so that it's widely spreadable. But I think we need to be sensitive to the environments in which our work's being done. So I think that's where the psychological component comes in beyond the blind logic that I talked about. The fourth one is foster discipline over disciplines. And the idea here is to, stay keen to the fact that our solutions can trigger undesirable outcomes. Staying attentive to the failure modes is a matter of discipline. It's not a matter of physics, chemistry, environmental biology, or nanochemistry. I think failure mode analysis is just simply a matter of discipline. So I think that's the level of kind of transcendentalism we need. So we need more discipline than disciplines. Fifth one, relate first, rationalize next. And we all know bulk of the complexity, whether it's COVID or a simple retweet, emerges from our relationships. And I think the interactive element, and I think that is the crux of the civics that unites us. But I think rationality works only part-time. Relationality works all the time. So I think we need to get good at relating first and rationalizing next. The sixth one, progress comes from participation. Again, there's an answer in this for you, Prakash. I mean, because we all choose to participate in the social media, and of course, the emphasis often goes to the media, but not the social part of it. I think. How do you think about this and making active reflection a part of the exercise that goes beyond the contracts and the commissions that the engineers are often put into? So there's quite a bit of discomfort to be confronted here, and that's going to take some work. Being more participatory is an excellent theoretical concept even now. But reducing it to practice is something that we need to get better at. And the people with the most amount of experience in reducing things to practice, even engineers, have the biggest struggle right now. Finally, focus more on care than creation. We have too many new things, too much novelty, I think, and there's nothing wrong with it, but overvaluing novelty, the expense of the essential wisdom and the traditions, and the kind of the mundane, daily, tiring, vexing work. Something needs to be said about that. So we can all be very creative and reckless at the same time. But I think focusing more on care and maintenance, repair, renewability, refurbishment, all those kinds of elements, I think could benefit from more deeper reflection. And that is innately a slower process. When I say something is fast and something is slow, this group will immediately understand from a psychological perspective. But I think that's the shift that's needed. I'll send this in a chat or so, or send you the link for the 7 habits, by the way. So that's my answer, non-answer to your question.
Oh, that helps a lot, Guru. Specialized layer systemize more, understand the laws of ecology, logic and psychology, foster discipline, relate first, rationalize next. Progress comes from participation, focus more on care than on creation. And the laws of ecology from Garrett Hardin's, I think, Filter Against Folly, asking and then what, or a second order thinking, has something that we have talked about a lot as a company, 1001 Stories, as a group out here too. But we feel a lot more powerful now. Like, instead of just having laws of ecology, you got like 6 more, 7 of them. And we also relate to what one of our previous speakers taught us, Lighty Kludge. He wrote this book about subtract. The whole premise has been, last point which you made, focus more on care than on creating or accumulating the new. We seem to be collecting too much information, listening to too many podcasts, reading too many books, retaining nothing. There is a lot of wisdom in those 7. We'll remember those. We'll share it out to our team members. And before I get greedy, I want to call in Louise, because I think I'm going to a greedy zone right now. Louise, please come over here, push me up the stage, and start the Q&As. Thank you so much, Guru.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Prakash. And I don't think anyone minds that running over, because if anyone was like me, we all had pens in hand and we were scribbling down all of Guru's 7 laws of Guru. So super. And I'm sure that Lashizar's ears were twitching when you gave number 2, get over physics envy and try ecology envy. Lashizar and Sam very interested in using evolutionary theory and behavioral science. So I think we've time for maybe 3 questions. So I'm going to bring in Priyanka. Your question sort of segues very well into what Guru was talking about. You had a question about engineering and the difference from artistic creation. Would you like to put your question, Priyanka?
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Guru. It's been very informing. This is definitely one of the most calming talks I've heard in a very, very long time. So just going from there and what you were speaking about constraint, I wondered what you think is the difference between how engineers create and between I'm a painter, so the rest of us, like in terms of creation, or like and the concept of how we look at constraint, and how would you suggest they address, how would we address action bias in our work? What do you understand of action bias and constraint? And is action bias necessary for iteration as a process? Is it like is action bias a natural part of iteration process? Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a profound question. I mean, I was thinking while you were talking, but instead of giving what intuitively came up as a response here, I was really thinking about Alexander Calder, who is a renowned artist who was trained as an engineer. And he's on great display in pretty much all the major art galleries in the world. And he began his career really thinking about how systems interact, how systems basically hinge on one another. And that really the practicality part of it, I mean, what he tried to do in the machine shop as a mechanical engineer, he eventually led to the artistic movement of how art could be, art necessarily doesn't have to be on a canvas hung on a wall or shaped and polished, that is rock, that is into a sculpture. So he came up with the whole idea for mobiles and how, and using the environment to thrive, to give the viewers a different experience. The art that you're looking at one moment from one angle is not the same the next moment from the next angle. So that's the kind of subjectivity that art brings to it. That's the case with engineering as well. We unfortunately don't emphasize the subjective elements of engineering design often. We think it's a purely reductionist, blind, objective pursuit of producing something that does something to someone. And I think the subjective elements are extremely important and have something deeply in common with art. Plus, another element that is not often talked about is how political engineering is. Engineering has significant political dimensions, and in fact, serious good engineers won't refuse this at all. In fact, if you go and ask some of the engineers working in the military sector, they'll say engineering is basically politics by other means. Art is also political, so you can see a deep synergy there, and I think this is where other forms of intellectual practices that claim to distance themselves from the politics of it have a struggle, because the moment they get to the kind of the fringes or the territories, kind of the edge of the blanket, basically into the politics, they say, boy, this is something we don't have any experience with. Engineers might say, well, that's a political thing. I'm not interested in doing this. That's not our job. That's one thing to say, but the work we're doing is innately political, just as art is. Art promotes new ideas. In fact, many political movements have emerged from artistic movements, and engineering has been an invisible support system in all of those things. So there's a higher level of synergy there, Priyanka. This is the extent to which I've thought about this. Thanks for this really thoughtful question.
Thank you.
Super, thanks so much, Priyanka. I feel like we could have a whole new talk there now, Guru. Engineering is political, as is art. That'll be your next essay to publish, maybe. And we said we don't shy away from a little bit of confrontation in this group. And I'd like to bring in Mariah with your second question. Mariah, you're interested in challenging Guru on one of his statements.
I'm no guru by any means, so I'm just going to go by facts. I dwell in the logic world, so I actually disagree with you when you said engineering is actually older than science, and that is because astronomy is the oldest science that we as humans have looked at. We looked at stars, we made observations. And then from there on, we actually delved into philosophy. Philosophy during the Greeks' time, the Aristotle was actually considered the science. So it ties in very well with behavioral science. Back then, that was philosophy. And then the next science that evolved after astronomy and philosophy was the medical observations that Homer did on bodies. So that ties
Sorry
into
to
the
jump in there,
medical world.
Mariah. Shall we let Guru respond to your comment?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes. Please respond. Yes.
That's a
So
good observation.
engineering is engineering is down the road. So yeah, please just substantiate why you put engineering at the top of the world.
Yes, without engineering, none of those enterprises practices that you talked about would be possible even. And that's mainly because we have not articulated the value of engineering that brought to some of these creations. In fact, I recommend Freeman Dyson's book, a provocative book, where he says that without telescope, science would not be possible. And he basically uses a kind of the instrumental kind of the form of knowledge there. So if you even go back to the origins of civilization and so forth, I mean, the kind of the structures that we have built and the way we thought about directing the flows of rivers and everything. So those are all, perhaps they probably didn't rise up to the intellectual gravitas of the enterprises we talked about, but without them, none of those you mentioned would have been possible.
So I think overall, my take on this is that once we declare one to be ahead of others, we're going to fail as a human race. I think we need all of those aspects to work together.
Exactly.
You know, we need the
That is
medical,
exactly
we need the...
point. No, that's, you made my point. So
good.
Because we somehow conveniently forget engineering as the kind of the backroom support system. And without it, we wouldn't be having this conversation in fairly time here.
Right. And we need somebody in sales and marketing to sell the engineering concepts as well. Let's not forget those guys.
Oh, that's excellent, because I'm just finishing up a piece on preview of my next article, which is actually due on Monday. It's a piece on showmanship. Mariah, I think I'll send you a copy of it, which really looks at how we are good at kind of celebrating certain forms of achievements. And this has happened in engineering all the time, right? Of course, you have seen the turtleneck tactics of Steve Jobs when he was launching products. Of course, Thomas Edison's big time, demonstrations, kind of mother of all demos when he was introducing lighting. And we have known cases, this was even like 1850s or so, before some of the more modern forms of physics and everything existed, when the elevators that were taking stuff for granaries and warehouses, basically load sharing. I mean, so I think we don't see those kinds of support systems as kind of the engineering and raising to a level of intellectual status perhaps, but that's my point here, because sewer system is much older. In fact, engineering is a mother of public health, and we often give credit somewhere else. Going back to the 14th, 15th, 16th century, I've had really advanced forms of public health in the name of engineering than what we now recognize it. In fact, if you look at the very first director of CDC, he was an engineer. But since then, if you look at how our understanding and practice of public health has evolved, it's quite different than how we have practiced, because now engineering assigned to the tech sector type thing. But I think we are looking at engineering as a sensibility to just end on a very friendly, cordial agreement. I think, Mariah, you and I are agreeing on this topic, why it is a mistake to emphasize one form of knowledge over the other. That's exactly what I'm arguing for engineering.
Okay, good, thank
That's
you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mariah.
So Louise is very well behaved here.
Super. So now I'd like to bring in Tony. Tony has a question about hamburgers.
Of course, why not? Well, what I've been seeing is that systems are changing all the time. So, but the front-facing or the consumer-facing experience doesn't change. And the example I used in my question was McDonald's, because if I walked into a McDonald's in 1990, there was a series of systems behind that delivered the food and the experience to me. And here we are in 2021, and that experience is relatively the same, but the systems are completely different for providing that. And, so my big question, you were talking about decision making at the time. My question really was, well, how do we make decisions when our assumptions about what is going on behind the scenes is 40 years out of date or 30 years out of date? And that might be, and I was thinking further, that maybe even be the source of some of our political disruption in the United States right now, is because some people are thinking the world works one way and some people think the world works another way, and everybody's assumptions are jumbled.
Yeah.
Just throwing it out there for your thoughts, Guru.
Yes, thank you, accepted, received, and I'll process this. I think one of the, it's not again a response to your question because you provoked kind of an idea here, but really interested in seeing how from, again, a systems engineering perspective, which largely gained prominence over the past 60, 70 years or so, mainly because we have applied that more fruitfully in the defense, aerospace, manufacturing sectors and so forth. But a sensibility of it has existed throughout. And it's kind of one of those nature versus nurture debate where I think somehow we've all nurtured ourselves to become hyper specialized in something, to the point that we even within, to go back to the previous point that Mariah was making, even within astronomy, there are like an umpteen number of astronomies. So, and one person doesn't speak to another. And in surgery, it's even bad. As the joke goes, there's a right-hand surgeon and a left-hand surgeon. They don't agree with one another. And and I think something that is happening even within engineering, and I think that's part of it, maybe the way the market forces are dictating and the way the contracts are written and the way the systems are being thought of from the get-go, for which new products, services, and others are expected. But I think how do you bring some of these time-tested concepts? We talked about efficiency, right, Louise? And there are tremendous benefits to efficiency. But I think when we go a little bit overdose on it, all sorts of complications start to happen. And how do you bring into some of this efficiencies there? I mean, resilience is one thing that engineers constantly struggle with, and not in a traditional sense about how do you create systems that just rebound and go back to the function that they were doing. I think resilience is a little bit more nuanced in it, and you can see how society is adapting the COVID return to work thing, because now a lot of people think of it as a set point. Let's go back to February 2020, and I think that's not possible.
Go back to normal, right?
Right. So I think that needs to be adapted, and I think that's where much more work needs to be done in terms of psychological and evolutionary perspective being brought to direct bear in the engineering design.
I think that's a good point. I'm just going to throw one more thing out and I'll turn it back to you, Louise. But, before you were talking about scientists, the word scientist didn't even exist until 150, 200 years ago or something. Before that, they were known as natural philosophers.
Yeah.
And that, I think there was a much looser idea of what made our reality. And I think scientists today they're becoming, they know more and more about less and less. So they get, the Newtonian look, right? They're getting down into the finer minutia. But really, we are systems and relationships, and how that works together, I think, is incredibly important, if not more important as well.
Well put, Tony. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Tony. We've just had brilliant questions, and I think we should package this recording and sell it as engineering is exciting, because I've been very excited by everything I've heard today. I never would have thought I'd be so interested in everything that's been said. So, Guru, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here, for you to share your 7 rules of how to get better at systems thinking. And you've been throwing out the lines, engineering is political, and I scribbled down the turtleneck tactics of Steve Jobs. So thank you so much, Guru, for joining us today. Thank you all the members for joining us today. I'm going to hand back to Prakash to wrap up the event, and next week we will be joined by Divya Balakrishna, who is the co-founder of Mensa. Thank you, Prakash. Thank you, Guru.
Thank you so much, Louise. Guys, do join in for Divya's session, because, fun fact, Divya is an engineer by training, number 1. Number 2, CS worked in one of the really good behavioral science, neuroscience companies, in the country for a good number of time. Number three, she quit the job recently to put up this product together called Mensa. And it's a fantastic app which helps people have conversations. And there's a lot of behavioral science insight built into that app, right? So we'll probably have a carryover from Guru's insights about engineers and behavior out there to the discussion. There is this one couplet in India, and it goes, Guru Govind do khade kaku lago pae, baliharo Guru mero apno Govindio bataye. Guru is a teacher. Govind means the Lord, the God himself. And the person is wondering, my teacher and my God, they're both standing in front of me. Whom do I acknowledge first? And I'm in this dilemma. And my God tells me, of course, dummy, it's your Guru. You have to acknowledge him first. Thank you so much, Guru. It is enlightening. Fantastic session. You took up complex questions from us. You freely gave your time. And we love those 7 principles. I think I'm going to share them with the entire group. Thank you so much. Before you go, any parting words, suggestions for us?
Yeah, I think one of the other things that another engineering professor taught me early on is like never settle quickly. And I think I'm a work in progress. So the opportunity that you've given me today, and especially the really thought-provoking questions from our colleagues here, and you can see how much, very much, I'm a work in progress as the ideas are evolving. And the opportunities like this are truly valuable because we get to think about a subject matter that we don't necessarily think about all the time, but put together, we return as changed, potentially transformed individuals. And today's an auspicious day. I thank Prakash for picking it and for making it all special for us. And Luis, thanks for your masterful work as always. And thanks to everyone for joining.
Thank you, Guru.
Very much.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Same time next week. See you next week. Bye now.